Rain hammered the asphalt as the black SUV's tires screamed to a halt. Three shadows spilled out like death incarnate.
Stay alert!
Their movements precise.
Eyes open. Target's
Predatory.
unclear. Formation.
Lucas
Cover all
Harrison's
angles.
weathered hands,
Put the
hands that
weapon
had gripped
down.
hammers and
You don't
concrete
stand a
all day,
chance.
suddenly moved with
Then
the
come and
fluid
take
grace
it.
of something far more dangerous. 8-year-old Jessie cowered behind twisted metal, her small fingers clutching silver dog tags that had somehow escaped from her father's most guarded secret. Blood painted crimson trails down Vivian Sterling's porcelain cheek as she pressed trembling palms against the gash. The lead hunter's weapon gleamed under streetlights. Finger poised, heart stopping. "Jessie, down now! Don't watch!" Lucas's command sliced through chaos like a war cry. Vivian's breath caught as this ordinary construction worker transformed before her eyes into something lethal, something trained to kill. These professional killers believed they were hunting a struggling single father and a vulnerable female CEO. They had no idea what hidden skill was about to rewrite their fate forever. 12 hours earlier, the pneumatic drill's relentless pounding echoed through the downtown construction site like mechanical thunder. Lucas Harrison wiped concrete dust
Put
from
the
his
weapon
safety
down.
goggles,
You don't
each
stand a
particle
chance.
gritty against weathered
Then come
skin
and take
that
it.
told stories of too many sleepless nights. His thermos sat empty beside a crumpled brown bag, lunch sacrificed again to meet impossible deadlines. The foreman's voice crackled through radio static, demanding faster progress on the foundation that would house another gleaming office tower. Lucas's shoulders ached, but he kept drilling. Every minute of overtime meant another $1 toward the medical bills that multiplied faster than he could count them. His phone buzzed against denim, the vibration cutting through machinery noise like a knife. Children's Hospital of Philadelphia flashed across the cracked screen, each letter carrying the weight of his worst fears. Dr. Sarah Coleman's voice emerged through speaker static, professional yet tinged with urgency that made his chest tighten. "Mr. Harrison, we've reviewed Jessie's latest echocardiogram. Her mitral valve stenosis has progressed more rapidly than anticipated." The drill slipped from his grip, clattering against concrete as medical terminology crashed over him like waves against drowning shores. "How long?" The question scraped past his throat, raw and desperate. Dr. Coleman's pause stretched like eternity before she delivered the verdict that would reshape everything. 2 weeks maximum before we risk complete heart failure. The surgery cannot wait longer. $87,000. The number hung in stale air between them, as insurmountable as mountain peaks. His insurance would cover perhaps $20,000, leaving a chasm that construction wages could never bridge. Lucas stared at his reflection in a puddle of rainwater, seeing a man whose daughter needed a miracle he couldn't provide. 23 floors above the construction chaos, Vivian Sterling stood behind floor-to-ceiling windows that transformed the city into an abstract painting of lights and shadows. Her corner office at Sterling Pharmaceuticals bore the pristine perfection of inherited success. Mahogany desk polished to mirror brightness, diplomas arranged with museum precision, family photographs that captured happier times before everything turned to ash. She pressed manicured fingers against glass, watching construction workers below move like ants in carefully choreographed patterns. None of them knew that the woman above held evidence that could destroy everything her father had built. The manila folder on her desk contained documents that transformed her inheritance into a nightmare of corporate corruption. Clinical trial reports with falsified data, financial records showing impossible profit margins, email chains discussing cost optimization that meant replacing life-saving cancer medications with sugar pills and cornstarch. Over 3,000 patients had received these counterfeit drugs in the past 18 months, their hope purchased with poison disguised as medicine. Vivian's hands trembled as she studied photographs of patients who had trusted Sterling Pharmaceuticals with their final months, their faces haunting her through sleepless nights. Her assistant's voice emerged through the intercom like a lifeline
Put the
thrown
weapon
to a
down.
drowning
You
woman.
don't stand a chance.
Ms. Sterling, your
Then
father's
come and
attorney
take
is here
it.
for the estate documents. But Vivian knew better. James Morrison had been more than her father's lawyer. He had been his confessor, his enabler, and quite possibly his killer. The heart attack that claimed Richard Sterling 6 months ago had been convenient timing, occurring just hours before he planned to meet with federal investigators. Now Morrison sat in her waiting room, probably wondering what secrets she had uncovered in the vault her father had hidden behind false walls and encrypted passwords. The phone rang for the 13th time that day, caller ID showing only blocked numbers that filled her with dread. She had stopped answering after the 7th call, each silence more threatening than spoken words could ever be. Someone knew about her investigation, someone with resources and connections that reached into shadows she couldn't illuminate. The parking garage felt different now when she walked to her car, every footstep echoing with possibility of violence. Hotel receipts in her father's files showed mysterious trips to Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and other places where money disappeared into digital vaults that authorities could never touch. The USB drive hidden in her purse contained backup copies of everything, recorded conversations between board members discussing patient mortality rates like quarterly projections, financial transfers to offshore accounts that funded lavish lifestyles built on human suffering, correspondence with foreign manufacturers who produced pills that looked identical to FDA-approved medications but contained nothing except false hope. Vivian had spent weeks copying files, photographing documents, and recording meetings while pretending to be the grieving daughter, learning to run out her inheritance. Tomorrow morning, she would turn everything over to the FBI field office downtown. Consequences be damned. But tonight, she had to survive long enough to deliver justice for the 3,000 souls whose trust had been betrayed. The security cameras in the parking garage had been mysteriously malfunctioning for the past week. Technical difficulties that her IT department claimed were random but felt anything but coincidental. Her driver had called in sick 3 days running, leaving her to navigate city streets alone while unknown eyes tracked her movements. The weight of evidence in her briefcase felt heavier with each passing hour, a burden that might cost her life, but could save thousands of others. Lucas finished his shift as darkness swallowed the construction site, machinery falling silent like exhausted soldiers after battle. His pickup truck coughed to life, engine protesting the demands of too many miles and too little maintenance. The route home took him past gleaming office towers, where people like Vivian Sterling made decisions that shaped ordinary lives in ways they never understood. He thought about Jessie waiting in their cramped apartment, probably doing homework at the kitchen table that wobbled despite his repeated attempts to fix the broken leg. Mrs. Patterson from next door would be watching her, kind eyes hiding pity for the man who couldn't afford proper childcare. The emergency room bill from last month's cardiac episode sat unopened on his passenger seat, another reminder of how quickly medical debt could transform stable lives into financial quicksand. Jessie's medication alone cost $600 monthly, each pill precious as gemstones. The school nurse had called twice this week about episodes where his daughter's lips turned blue during recess, her small body fighting a battle that required weapons he couldn't afford. Sleep had become a luxury he couldn't indulge. Nights spent researching surgical procedures and payment plans that might as well have been written in foreign languages. The apartment building's elevator wheezed upward, carrying him toward the 7th floor where home meant everything that mattered, and nothing that lasted. Jessie's artwork covered their refrigerator like colorful bandages over deeper wounds. Crayon drawings of families that included a mother who existed now only in faded photographs and treasured memories. She never complained about the generic cereal or second-hand clothes, her resilience shaming him daily with its quiet strength. Tonight, she would ask about the hospital call, and he would have to lie with a smile that felt like breaking glass. Vivian Sterling drove through city streets that felt increasingly hostile. every shadow potentially concealing threats she couldn't identify. The parking garage beneath her apartment building echoed with footsteps that might have been her imagination or might have been surveillance. She clutched her briefcase tighter, knuckles white against leather handles worn
Put the
smooth
weapon
by
down.
her father's hands.
You don't stand a chance.
The elevator ride to the
Then come
penthouse
and
felt
take
like
it.
ascending toward judgment, each floor bringing her closer to a reckoning that had been building since the day she discovered the truth about Sterling Pharmaceuticals. Her apartment's pristine silence felt suffocating after the revelations that had shattered her world. Family photographs mocked her from silver frames, capturing moments when she had believed her father was a man of integrity who built his pharmaceutical empire through innovation and compassion. Now she knew those smiles had been lies, those achievements built on graves of people who had trusted Sterling medications with their final hopes. The weight of inherited guilt pressed against her chest like a physical presence, demanding action that could cost everything she had ever known. The anonymous phone calls had escalated to photographs slipped under her door, images of her leaving the office, entering her apartment, meeting with the private investigator who had helped her decode her father's encrypted files. Someone wanted her to know that privacy was an illusion, that safety depended on silence about crimes that reached into the highest levels of corporate and political power. Tomorrow's FB meeting represented either salvation or suicide, depending on how deeply the corruption had penetrated federal agencies that were supposed to protect people like those her father had killed. She opened the vault hidden behind a false wall in her father's study, extracting documents that proved Sterling Pharmaceuticals had knowingly distributed counterfeit cancer drugs to maximize profit margins. Clinical trials had been falsified, safety reports fabricated, and patient deaths attributed to disease progression rather than the sugar pills disguised as life-saving medication. The scope of the conspiracy reached beyond her father's company into networks of manufacturers, distributors, and regulatory officials who had traded human lives for financial gain that funded luxury lifestyles built on systematic murder. Lucas tucked Jessie into bed, her small frame dwarfed by blankets that couldn't warm the chill of impending loss. She had asked about the hospital call with 8-year-old directness that cut through adult pretenses like surgical instruments. "Are you worried about my heart, Daddy?" Her question carried wisdom beyond her years, understanding that fear lived in the spaces between his careful words. He had kissed her forehead and promised that everything would be okay, another lie added to the collection that protected her from truths too heavy for small shoulders to bear. The silver dog tags hidden in his dresser drawer caught moonlight streaming through bedroom windows, metal surfaces reflecting memories of another life when his hands had saved lives instead of mixing concrete. Staff Sergeant Lucas Harrison, 22nd Medical Battalion, Army Special Forces. 3 tours in Afghanistan, where he had performed battlefield surgery under conditions that would terrify civilian doctors, his team responsible for keeping wounded soldiers alive long enough to reach proper medical facilities. The skills remained sharp despite 5 years of deliberate suppression, muscle memory that could be reactivated by necessity or desperation. His wife Sarah's photograph smiled from the bedside table, her image frozen in happier times before cancer had transformed their lives into a countdown toward inevitable loss. She had died despite access to the best medications money could buy, her body fighting a battle that no amount of love or determination could win. Now Jessie faced her own medical crisis, and Lucas found himself powerless once again to protect the person who mattered most. The irony cut deep. A man trained to save lives couldn't save the ones that gave his existence meaning. The construction job had been supposed to provide stability, honest work that paid bills without requiring him to carry weapons or make life and death decisions. But honest work didn't pay enough for medical emergencies, and stability meant nothing when your daughter needed surgery that cost more than most people earned in 2 years. He stared at his reflection in the darkened window, seeing a man caught between the life he had chosen and the one that circumstances might force him to reclaim. Vivian Sterling's penthouse apartment felt like a mausoleum filled with artifacts from a life built on lies she had never questioned. Her father's study remained exactly as he had left it, books arranged with military precision, awards from pharmaceutical organizations that now seemed like trophies celebrating successful deception. The hidden vault contained documents that proved Sterling Pharmaceuticals had systematically murdered cancer patients for profit, replacing real medications with placebos that offered false hope while ensuring maximum financial return on human suffering. The conspiracy reached beyond pharmaceutical manufacturing into distribution networks, regulatory agencies, and political offices that facilitated the greatest medical fraud in American history. Patient advocacy groups had been infiltrated by Sterling employees who diverted attention from mortality statistics that revealed the truth about counterfeit medications. Hospital administrators had received financial incentives to prefer Sterling products, their silence purchased with donations and research grants that funded luxurious facilities built on foundations of systematic murder. Her father's encrypted files contained recorded conversations with government officials who had agreed to delay investigations in exchange for campaign contributions and consulting fees. The corruption penetrated so deeply into federal agencies that she wondered if tomorrow's FBI meeting would result in justice or simply alert the conspirators that their crimes had been discovered. 3,000 patients had died believing they were receiving life-saving medications, their families never knowing that loved ones had been murdered for profit margins that funded pharmaceutical executives' lavish lifestyles. The USB drive in her purse contained enough evidence to destroy Sterling Pharmaceuticals and send dozens of conspirators to federal prison for life. But it also contained enough motivation for those conspirators to kill anyone who threatened to expose their crimes. The photographs slipped under her door showed that her apartment building's security had been compromised, her movements tracked by professionals who understood that witnesses represented existential threats to billion-dollar criminal enterprises. Tomorrow morning would determine whether justice prevailed or whether she joined the growing list of victims who had trusted the wrong people. Lucas Harrison drove through empty streets toward the 24-hour diner where insomnia and desperation often led him when sleep became impossible. The weight of Jesse's medical crisis pressed against his chest like a physical presence, each breath carrying the taste of fears too terrible to voice. $87,000 might as well have been $87 million, an impossible sum that construction wages could never provide. The army had taught him to solve problems through decisive action, but civilian problems required resources he didn't possess and skills that legal society didn't value. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like mechanical insects, casting harsh shadows across cracked vinyl booths where night shift workers and insomniacs sought refuge from problems that daylight couldn't solve. Coffee tasted bitter and burned, fuel for another sleepless night spent calculating payment plans that might save his daughter's life. The newspaper's classified section offered opportunities for men with his particular skills: private security, corporate protection, military consulting, work that paid enough to matter but required him to become someone he had spent 5 years trying to forget. His phone contained contact information for Marcus Webb, his former team leader, who now ran a private military contractor specializing in corporate protection and asset recovery. One phone call could reconnect him with a world where his medical training and combat experience commanded premium wages, where clients paid extraordinary sums for men capable of extraordinary violence. But that world also meant abandoning the quiet life he had built for Jessie, trading her father's presence for the money that might save her life. The moral calculus felt impossible: sacrifice his principles to save his daughter, or maintain his integrity while watching her die from a condition that money could cure. Sarah's voice echoed from memory, reminding him that being a good father sometimes meant making choices that contradicted everything else you believed. The dog tags in his pocket felt heavier than their actual weight, metal pressing against his chest like a reminder of capabilities he had sworn never to use again. Vivian Sterling sat in her car outside the FBI field office, dawn breaking over a city that had no idea how close it had come to witnessing systematic murder disguised as pharmaceutical innovation. The USB drive felt warm in her palm, plastic and metal containing digital evidence that could save thousands of lives while destroying her own. Federal agents moved through the building's lobby like actors in a play she couldn't quite understand, their purposes hidden behind professional facades that might conceal corruption or genuine commitment to justice. Her father's encrypted files had revealed the depth of Sterling Pharmaceuticals' criminal conspiracy, but they had also shown how deeply that conspiracy penetrated federal agencies responsible for drug approval and safety oversight. The FBI agents she was about to meet might be honest investigators committed to justice, or they might be corrupted officials whose loyalty had been purchased with the same blood money that funded every aspect of the counterfeit drug operation. 3,000 patients had trusted pharmaceutical regulations that failed them, their families never knowing that loved ones had been systematically murdered for profit. The parking garage where everything began felt like a lifetime ago, though only 12 hours had passed since 3 professional killers had tried to silence her forever. Lucas Harrison had emerged from nowhere like an answer to prayers she hadn't known how to pray. His construction worker facade dissolving to reveal training that belonged in special operations rather than civilian employment. The man who had saved her life remained a mystery wrapped in contradictions that suggested depth she couldn't fathom. But now she sat alone outside the FBI building, clutching evidence that could either destroy a criminal conspiracy or get her killed by agents whose loyalty had been compromised. The USB drive contained recorded conversations proving that Sterling Pharmaceuticals had deliberately manufactured counterfeit cancer medications, replacing active ingredients with inert substances that offered false hope while ensuring maximum profit margins. Hospital administrators, regulatory officials, and pharmaceutical executives had collaborated in the systematic murder of patients whose only crime was trusting institutions that were supposed to protect them. Lucas Harrison walked through the construction site where his transformation from father to soldier had begun just hours earlier. The pneumatic drill sat silent beside concrete foundations that would support another gleaming office tower, another symbol of legitimate business built by honest workers who couldn't afford the medical care their families needed. His hands still bore traces of concrete dust, but they had remembered how to disable armed men with efficiency that terrified him almost as much as it had saved Vivian Sterling's life. The parking garage confrontation had awakened instincts he had spent 5 years suppressing, muscle memory that transformed him from struggling single father into lethal operative in the space between heartbeats. Jessie had seen enough to ask uncomfortable questions about why her father moved like soldiers on television, her 8-year-old perception cutting through pretenses that had fooled everyone else. The dog tags she had discovered in his hidden drawer represented a past that felt simultaneously foreign and familiar, like clothing that still fit despite years of disuse. Vivian Sterling had witnessed his transformation with eyes that missed nothing, her corporate background apparently including the ability to recognize trained killers when they revealed themselves. The blood on her forehead had come from men who intended to torture information from her before delivering a death disguised as random violence, their professional equipment and coordinated tactics suggesting resources that extended far beyond ordinary criminal enterprises. Someone with serious money and government connections wanted her silenced permanently. The conspiracy she had uncovered reached into pharmaceutical manufacturing, federal regulatory agencies, and political offices that facilitated the greatest medical fraud in American history. 3,000 cancer patients had received counterfeit medications, their hope purchased with poison disguised as life-saving drugs. The profit margins were extraordinary. Real medications cost $12 per dose to manufacture, while fake versions cost less than $2, generating hundreds of millions in additional revenue that funded lavish lifestyles built on systematic murder. Now Lucas found himself caught between the life he had chosen and circumstances that demanded capabilities he had tried to forget. Jesse needed surgery that cost $87,000, an impossible sum that construction wages could never provide. But the skills that could generate that money belonged to a world he had abandoned, a world where violence solved problems that civilian society couldn't address. The moral calculus felt impossible: sacrifice his principles to save his daughter, or maintain his integrity while watching her die from a condition that money could cure. Vivian Sterling entered the FBI field office, carrying evidence that could destroy Sterling Pharmaceuticals and send dozens of conspirators to federal prison for life. Agent Rebecca Morrison met her in a secure conference room, her professional demeanor suggesting competence and integrity that might offer hope for justice. The USB drive contained recorded conversations between pharmaceutical executives discussing patient mortality rates like quarterly earnings projections, financial records proving systematic fraud, and correspondence with foreign manufacturers who produced counterfeit medications identical to FDA-approved drugs in appearance, but containing nothing except false hope. Ms. Sterling, these allegations are extremely serious, Agent Morrison said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that pharmaceutical fraud meant mass murder disguised as medical treatment. If Sterling Pharmaceuticals has been manufacturing counterfeit cancer medications, we're talking about potentially thousands of victims whose deaths could have been prevented. The scope of the conspiracy reached beyond pharmaceutical manufacturing into distribution networks, regulatory agencies, and political offices that facilitated the systematic murder of patients whose only crime was trusting institutions designed to protect them. But even as Vivian turned over evidence that could save thousands of lives, Lucas Harrison faced an impossible choice between his daughter's survival and his own moral code. The construction job that was supposed to provide stability couldn't generate the money Jesse needed for heart surgery, leaving him to consider options that would transform him back into the soldier he had tried to forget. Marcus Webb's private military company paid extraordinary sums for men with his particular combination of medical training and combat experience, but accepting that work meant abandoning the quiet life he had built. The dog tags Jesse had discovered represented capabilities that civilian society didn't value, but that desperate circumstances might require. Staff Sergeant Lucas Harrison, 22nd Medical Battalion, Army Special Forces, had saved lives under conditions that would terrify civilian doctors, his team responsible for keeping wounded soldiers alive during operations that existed only in classified files. Those skills remained sharp despite 5 years of deliberate suppression, muscle memory that could be reactivated by necessity or desperation. 3 hours later, Lucas Harrison stood outside Marcus Webb's private security office, his decision made by love that transcended every principle he had once held sacred. The job Marcus offered involved protecting a pharmaceutical executive whose company faced investigation for manufacturing counterfeit medications, protection that paid enough to cover Jesse's surgery with money left over for follow-up care. The irony cut deep, using skills developed to save lives in order to protect someone who might have profited from systematic murder disguised as medical treatment. But Jesse's life mattered more than his comfort with moral ambiguity, her survival worth any compromise his conscience might demand. Marcus Webb's handshake felt like stepping back into a world he had abandoned, professional relationships built on shared understanding of violence as a problem-solving tool. "The client is Vivian Sterling," Marcus explained, his words carrying implications that made Lucas's chest tighten with recognition.
Put the weapon down. You don't stand a chance.
Someone's been trying to kill her,
Then
and
come and
yesterday's
take it.
attempt in the parking garage nearly succeeded. The woman whose life he had saved represented everything he had tried to escape: corporate corruption, systematic exploitation, the kind of institutional evil that required violent solutions civilian society couldn't provide. But she also represented Jesse's chance for survival, the money that could pay for surgery that would give his daughter the future she deserved. Personal feelings meant nothing compared to medical necessity. His daughter's life worth protecting anyone from any threat that money could buy. The security contract specified round-the-clock protection for Vivian Sterling, whose investigation into pharmaceutical fraud had apparently uncovered evidence that threatened billion-dollar criminal enterprises. The men who had tried to kill her possessed resources and training that suggested government connections, their coordinated assault indicating systematic planning rather than random violence. Someone with serious money and political influence wanted her silenced permanently, her evidence destroyed before it could reach federal investigators. Lucas Harrison signed the contract that would transform him back into a professional warrior, his medical training and combat experience suddenly worth more than years of construction work. The money would cover Jesse's surgery with enough remaining for follow-up care and living expenses during her recovery, financial security purchased with skills he had hoped never to use again. But love demanded sacrifice, and being a good father sometimes meant becoming someone you had tried to forget. Vivian Sterling sat in the FBI conference room as Agent Morrison reviewed evidence that proved Sterling Pharmaceuticals had systematically murdered cancer patients for profit. The recorded conversations were damning. Pharmaceutical executives discussing patient mortality rates with the casual indifference of people calculating acceptable losses in pursuit of maximum profit margins. Financial records showed hundreds of millions of dollars generated by replacing life-saving medications with inert placebos that offered false hope while ensuring extraordinary returns on human suffering. This evidence is sufficient for federal prosecution, Agent Morrison confirmed, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had spent years investigating pharmaceutical fraud without finding proof this comprehensive. We can arrest the primary conspirators within 72 hours and freeze Sterling Pharmaceuticals' assets pending criminal proceedings. But victory felt hollow when weighed against 3,000 lives lost to systematic deception, families who would never know that their loved ones had been murdered for quarterly earnings projections. The conspiracy reached beyond pharmaceutical manufacturing into regulatory agencies whose officials had been purchased with campaign contributions and consulting fees that funded lavish lifestyles built on systematic murder. Hospital administrators had received financial incentives to prefer Sterling products, their silence bought with donations and research grants that supported medical facilities unknowingly complicit in mass murder disguised as healthcare innovation.
Then come and
the corruption penetrated so deeply into federal oversight that Vivian wondered how many other pharmaceutical companies were engaged in similar crimes. But even as justice moved forward, she remained a target for conspirators who understood that witnesses represented existential threats to billion-dollar criminal enterprises. The men who had tried to kill her in the parking garage possessed resources and training that suggested government connections, their professional equipment indicating systematic planning rather than random violence. Agent Morrison had arranged federal protection, but Vivian understood that government security might not be sufficient against enemies with unlimited resources and political connections that reached into agencies responsible for her safety. Lucas Harrison arrived at Vivian Sterling's penthouse apartment carrying equipment that transformed him from construction worker into professional bodyguard. The tactical vest felt familiar, despite 5 years of disuse. Kevlar and ceramic plates providing protection against threats that civilian clothing couldn't stop. His medical bag contained supplies for treating gunshot wounds and trauma injuries, skills that had kept wounded soldiers alive, now repurposed for protecting someone whose investigation had uncovered systematic murder disguised as pharmaceutical innovation. Vivian studied him with eyes that missed nothing, her corporate background apparently including the ability to recognize trained killers when circumstances forced them to reveal their true nature. "You're not really a construction worker," she
Put
said,
the weapon down.
the statement
You don't
carrying
stand a
certainty
chance.
rather than question.
Then come and
"Yesterday
take it.
in the parking garage, you moved like special forces." Her observation was accurate but incomplete. He had been Special Forces, medical specialist trained to save lives under conditions that would overwhelm civilian doctors. "I was a combat medic," Lucas replied, his admission feeling like stepping back into a world he had tried to forget. "Army Special Forces, 3 tours in Afghanistan. I left that life behind when my wife died. Thought I could be just a regular father working regular jobs." But regular jobs didn't pay enough for medical emergencies, and desperate circumstances had forced him to reclaim skills that civilian society didn't value, but that desperate people needed desperately. The security assessment revealed sophisticated surveillance equipment positioned throughout the building, professional-grade cameras and listening devices that indicated resources far beyond ordinary criminal enterprises. Whoever wanted Vivian Sterling dead possessed government connections and unlimited funding, their systematic approach suggesting institutional support rather than freelance assassination attempts. The men who had tried to kill her represented the visible edge of a conspiracy that reached into federal agencies responsible for pharmaceutical oversight and patient protection. "They killed my father when he tried to expose the counterfeit drug operation," Vivian explained, her voice carrying grief that had transformed into determination for justice. "Made it look like a heart attack during his morning swim, but he was a competitive swimmer who could handle distances that would exhaust men half his age." Richard Sterling had discovered that his pharmaceutical company was systematically murdering cancer patients for profit, his investigation threatening criminal enterprises that generated hundreds of millions in annual revenue. The evidence Vivian had turned over to the FBI would destroy Sterling Pharmaceuticals and send dozens of conspirators to federal prison, but it also ensured that she remained a target for people who understood that witness elimination was cheaper than legal defense. Lucas's job involved keeping her alive long enough for federal prosecutors to dismantle the criminal conspiracy that had transformed pharmaceutical manufacturing into systematic murder disguised as medical innovation. But protection duty meant more than preventing assassination attempts. It meant understanding the scope of the conspiracy that had made Vivian Sterling a target for professional killers. The counterfeit drug operation reached beyond Sterling Pharmaceuticals into networks of manufacturers, distributors, and regulatory officials who had collaborated in systematic murder that generated extraordinary profit margins. Cancer medications that cost $12 per dose to manufacture legitimately were replaced with placebos costing less than $2, creating hundreds of millions in additional revenue that funded lavish lifestyles built on human suffering. Patient advocacy groups had been infiltrated by pharmaceutical employees who diverted attention from mortality statistics that revealed the truth about counterfeit medications. Hospital administrators received financial incentives to prefer Sterling products, their cooperation purchased with donations and research grants that supported medical facilities and unknowingly complicit in mass murder. The corruption penetrated so deeply into healthcare infrastructure that Vivian wondered how many institutions designed to protect patients had been transformed into accomplices in systematic exploitation. 3 days into the protection assignment, Lucas Harrison had established security protocols that transformed Vivian Sterling's penthouse into a fortress capable of withstanding professional assault. Motion sensors covered every approach, camera systems provided comprehensive surveillance, and communication equipment maintained constant contact with federal agents coordinating the investigation. But security measures meant nothing against enemies with unlimited resources and government connections that reached into agencies responsible for witness protection. The assassination attempts escalated from surveillance to direct action, professional killers testing defenses with increasing sophistication and violence. Sniper fire from adjacent buildings, explosive devices planted in delivery packages, coordinated assaults by teams equipped with military-grade weapons and tactical coordination that suggested special operations training. Each attack revealed resources that extended far beyond ordinary criminal enterprises, systematic planning that indicated institutional support for witness elimination. Lucas's medical training proved as valuable as his combat skills, treating injuries sustained during attacks while maintaining defensive positions that protected Vivian from systematic assassination attempts. His equipment included trauma supplies for gunshot wounds and explosive injuries, battlefield medicine repurposed for urban warfare against enemies who possessed government resources and political connections that facilitated systematic murder. The irony wasn't lost. Skills developed to save soldiers' lives now protected someone whose investigation threatened institutional corruption that reached into federal oversight agencies. But the greatest threat came not from external assault, but from internal betrayal, federal agents whose loyalty had been purchased with the same blood money that funded pharmaceutical fraud. Agent Morrison's team included officers who provided intelligence to conspirators, their cooperation ensuring that witness protection became systematic elimination, disguised as security failure. Vivian Sterling faced enemies within institutions designed to protect her, corruption that penetrated so deeply into federal law enforcement that justice itself had been compromised. The final assault came at dawn, coordinated teams attacking from multiple directions with equipment and tactics that revealed military training and government resources. Lucas Harrison found himself fighting not just for Vivian Sterling's life, but for the principle that evidence of systematic murder should reach prosecutors rather than being buried with witnesses who had trusted federal protection. His combat skills, dormant for 5 years, reactivated with muscle memory that transformed suburban security into urban warfare. Sniper
Put the
positions
weapon
in
down.
adjacent
You don't
buildings,
stand a chance.
assault teams advancing
Then
through
come and take
underground
it.
tunnels, helicopter support providing aerial coordination. The attack revealed resources that extended far beyond pharmaceutical profit margins into government agencies whose officials had been systematically corrupted. Lucas's defensive preparations held long enough for honest federal agents to arrive with military support, but the battle demonstrated how deeply criminal conspiracy had penetrated institutions responsible for public safety and pharmaceutical oversight. The victory felt hollow despite its completeness. Vivian Sterling survived to testify, her evidence destroying Sterling Pharmaceuticals and sending dozens of conspirators to federal prison for systematic murder disguised as medical innovation. But Lucas Harrison understood that corruption this comprehensive couldn't be eliminated through single prosecutions, that pharmaceutical fraud represented institutional failure, requiring systematic reform rather than individual accountability. His contract payment covered Jessie's heart surgery with money remaining for follow-up care and living expenses during her recovery, financial security purchased with skills he had hoped never to use again. But love had demanded sacrifice, and being a good father sometimes meant becoming someone you had tried to forget. Dr. Sarah Coleman confirmed that the surgical procedure had been completely successful, Jessie's heart functioning normally for the first time in her young life. 6 months later, Lucas Harrison stood in the courthouse where pharmaceutical executives received life sentences for systematic murder disguised as medical innovation. Vivian Sterling's testimony had exposed corruption that reached into federal regulatory agencies, her investigation triggering reforms designed to prevent future pharmaceutical fraud. 3,000 families finally understood that their loved ones had been murdered for profit margins, their grief transformed into determination for systematic justice. The money from his protection contract had paid for Jessie's surgery and established a medical fund for her ongoing care. But Lucas understood that his daughter's recovery represented only temporary victory against institutions that systematically exploited vulnerable populations. Pharmaceutical fraud would continue as long as profit margins mattered more than patient safety. Regulatory capture ensured that oversight agencies served corporate interests rather than public health. But individual victories mattered even when systematic problems remained unsolved. Single lives saved despite institutional failure that threatened millions of others. Jessie Harrison would grow up healthy because her father had possessed skills that desperate circumstances required, his violence employed in service of love rather than institutional exploitation. The moral calculus remained complex, but results spoke louder than philosophical abstractions when measured against his daughter's laughter. Vivian Sterling established a pharmaceutical transparency foundation dedicated to exposing corruption and protecting patients from systematic exploitation disguised as medical innovation.
Put the weapon down.
Her experience
You don't
had
stand a
taught her that
chance.
institutional reform
Then come and
required
take it.
constant vigilance against enemies who possessed unlimited resources and government connections that facilitated systematic murder. The Foundation employed investigators, prosecutors, and security specialists whose combined expertise could identify and eliminate pharmaceutical fraud before it claimed additional victims. Lucas Harrison accepted a position as the Foundation's security director, his military training and medical background providing protection for investigators whose work threatened billion-dollar criminal enterprises. The job paid enough to ensure Jesse's continued medical care while employing his skills for purposes that aligned with his conscience rather than contradicting everything he believed. Former combat medic became protector of people whose investigations saved lives rather than ending them. The work remained dangerous. Pharmaceutical fraud generated enough profit to fund systematic violence against anyone who threatened criminal enterprises. But purpose transformed risk into acceptable sacrifice. Lucas's team protected investigators, prosecutors, and witnesses whose combined efforts dismantled criminal conspiracies that transformed medical treatment into systematic murder. His daughter grew up understanding that her father's work saved lives, his violence employed in service of justice rather than institutional exploitation. Years later, Jessie Harrison would study medicine herself, her career inspired by understanding that healthcare required constant protection against those who would transform healing into exploitation.
You don't stand a chance.
Her father's example taught her
Then
that
come and take
being
it.
good sometimes meant being dangerous, that protecting innocence required capabilities that peaceful society preferred to ignore. The dog tags that had once represented shame became symbols of sacrifice, evidence that love sometimes demanded becoming someone you had tried to forget. The pharmaceutical industry continued evolving. New regulations and oversight mechanisms designed to prevent systematic fraud from claiming additional victims. But Lucas Harrison understood that progress required eternal vigilance against enemies who possessed unlimited resources and institutional connections that facilitated systematic murder. His work protecting investigators and prosecutors represented ongoing warfare against corruption that threatened to transform medical treatment into exploitation disguised as healthcare innovation. Sometimes the most important battles were fought by individuals whose skills society preferred to ignore, whose violence served justice rather than institutional exploitation. Lucas Harrison had learned that being a good father sometimes meant becoming someone dangerous, that protecting those you loved required capabilities that civilian life couldn't provide. His daughter's life had been saved by skills developed for warfare, repurposed for love that transcended every principle he had once held sacred. What skill are you hiding that could save someone's life today?